Jacob Shapiro, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk to you about an issue that you brought up to me that I think is something that most people maybe don't fully understand, and that's the issue of populism. Most people view populism as something, define it by Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen in France, but you say that this is actually something that's happening in countries around the world, and this is an issue that governments everywhere are grappling with. Why don't you unpack this idea for me?
Well, I think the most important thing to note there, like you said, is that it's really happening everywhere. It's not just Donald Trump. It's not just whatever is the Nationalist Party in Europe that everybody's freaking out about. When you look at Russia, Russia is having serious economic problems. We saw that random bombing or whatever, we're not sure exactly what it was, but whatever was in St. Petersburg. There have also been these weird reports out of Chechnya and in the Caucasus and what they're having to do to crack down there. Part of that is also to think about the rise of the Muslim population in Russia, maybe one of the reasons that they're involved in trying to cut ISIS out from underneath itself. And then you look at China. China, which Xi Jinping has basically presided over the imposition of a dictatorship. And the reason he's doing that is because the coast has gotten incredibly wealthy, and the interior, while it's been lifted up an incredible amount from where it was, say 30 years ago, when 900 million people or something crazy like that were making less than $1.80 a day, or were living off of $1.80 a day. Now it's 300 million. So that's incredible progress. That's still 300 million people who haven't enjoyed in the success. And now China's growth miracle has run out, and they're trying to attempt a major shift in the situation. And to do that, Xi knows he needs complete control. That means in the military, that means in the countryside, that means everywhere. So all of ththese things that we're talking about when we talk about foreign policy and international relations between the United States and China, between the EU and Russia, Turkey and Germany, all of these states and all of these countries have their own internal problems, and in a lot of ways their own domestic problems are what's driving their actions. A lot of what they're doing is to boost themselves up at home. Turkey's a really good example of this, right? Erdogan has a referendum coming up which will give him more presidential powers. So what's he doing? He's picking fights with the Dutch and with the Germans for not letting them have rallies for the Turkish citizens there, because those Turkish citizens can vote in the referendum, and he gets to say, oh, well, the EU, this is the new crusading entity, and Turkey is not being respected. So when you look at all these things, I'm really struck by how a lot of what's going on is defined by internal dynamics and by what individual leaders are trying to do in order to manage these problems, rather than real differences between countries.
As this populism grows in each one of these places you've talked about, what does that mean when many of these leaders, the populism that they try to, the policies that they try to push through, populist policies, maybe fail? Do they all of a sudden turn all that energy externally to try to deflect from some of their failures internally?
Again, this depends really on a case-by-case basis. And this is a point where one of the nice things about populism or nationalism and thinking about it that way is that it really complicates things. You can't think about Europe as the EU. You have to think about Europe as a collection of a bunch of different nations. So this is going to mean very different things in a country like Germany than it's going to mean even in the United Kingdom, even in Spain, which has its own, is Catalonia going to have another illegal referendum? What are they going to do about that? Eastern Europe has its own concerns. That's very different than, say, Russia, which has very limited resources to tackle some of its issues because it's so dependent on the price of oil, and oil's probably not going to go back up, and there's going to have to be a reckoning there. China, for me, is one of the most interesting cases. When people who read GPF know that we're pretty bearish on China and that China's not going to be able to tackle this, but China's also come way further than probably anybody else expected. And I, for one, am incredibly curious about what are the Chinese going to be able to do, and is Xi going to be able to harness enough control to get it where he wants to go. The United States in all this, one of the reasons we're so bullish on the United States is because when it comes to resources in terms of tackling this question, the United States may have a lot of different problems. There are huge problems in the United States, especially with the decline of the middle class, but the United States has options. It has resources. So I think this all boils down when you're looking at each individual country, and will this be projected out externally in a country like Russia, where there are limited options and where the regime might feel that it needs to push itself outwards in order to boost internal credibility? Yeah, I would be pretty concerned. I'm not concerned about the US starting another war in the Middle East because the middle class is declining. So it really just depends on the particular political system, what resources they have to tackle it.
So final question along this tack then. What country are you the most concerned about in terms of a country that's embraced populism, but that maybe either it's failing or it's just not working, and it's either an attempt by the leadership or by the people themselves to try to save themselves from where they're going? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It does. And it may be strange to think about Russia in terms of populism, and Putin does have a great deal of popular support, but I would say the country that I'm most concerned about right now is Russia. And I don't think that because I don't think that Russia's about to invade Eastern Europe. I don't think they have the forces to do it. And I don't think that Russia has put Donald Trump in the White House, and I don't think that Russia's going to choose whether Le Pen is going to win or whether Merkel's going to win. I'm most concerned about what Russia looks like if it fractures and if it falls apart, or if Putin's ability to control what's going on falls apart, or if you take out Putin and there's nothing to do there. Because that's a really serious challenge. How do you deal with a Russia that is fragmenting all of its different military resources scattered across so many different regions with a lot of different borders and a lot of different insecure areas? So you don't think about Russia in terms of populism, in some ways because they don't have a choice, in some ways because people are very invested in Putin. And even despite all the challenges at a popular level, at least the polls tell us, you have to take the polls with a pretty large grain of salt, but it seems that the people do like Putin, and they think of Putin as projecting strength and doing all that other stuff. And I see that strength as pretty empty. And when that begins to fall apart, I worry about what that looks like for Russia itself and for everybody who's around it.
So a post-Putin Russia is probably a pretty dangerous place, is that what you're saying?
Yes. For me, looking out the next 5 to 10 years, if these protests in the countryside, and then the larger protests we saw in Moscow and St. Petersburg and that were all over the place, and the various banking crises that are happening, and the weird reports out of Chechnya and the Caucasus, and you've seen these random terrorist bombings too, and the economy not doing well. When you put all that together, and you think about Russian history and what happens when Russia gets that internally unstable, for me, looking at the next 5 years, that's one of the things to look at most closely.
That's something to definitely keep our eye on. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thanks.